Hey everyone, so one thing I've realised after teaching and applying cognitive function typology, specifically CPT, for about 4 years now, is just how abstract a lot of this stuff is. But one analogy I found really helpful to teach this stuff to clients is using the elements as comparison, and after applying it behind the scenes, it's actually taken off into its own kind of meta theory. And I'm actually pretty excited to present it to you in this video. As you may know, CPT sees cognitive functions working in pairs and networks rather than separate processing units, which makes it especially suitable for an elemental system, because here elements are interacting with each other and fusing together into kind of meta-elements, if you will. And a cognitive function in CPT is actually a pair of what I already referred to as cognitive elements. Extroverted sensing, that's a perceptual element. Extroverted thinking, that's a rational element. But if you pair them together into SE-TE, then you have a cognitive function. These building blocks of the system, these elements, if you will, fuse together into composites. And composites fuse into a network, and the network is itself within a meta-network of alternate pairings. This whole thing gets complex pretty fast, and it was important to be able to look for simpler, more intuitive ways of conveying the subject matter. So let's jump into the video, starting with the element of Earth. So this one is the easy one. After all, Earth is the domain of the permanent and the tangible. Imagine matter being squeezed into something more compact and unyielding. Well, within CPT, that is exactly what sensing does. Sensing constrains perception, and in doing so renders that which is perceived more tangible. It essentially squeezes perception into a smaller space. And that which is perceived within this narrow lens becomes a lot more dense as a result. As a concrete lens, sensing is the result of narrowing your own perception and increasing the resolution of what is perceived. In doing so, it fully renders a reality. Just as Earth forms solid matter, sensing constrains perception. And just as with the cognitive elements of CPT, Earth here can be positive or negative. That is, aversive or incentive to our dopamine circuits. Earth can represent security, a feeling of belonging, somewhere to come home to. Trust, faith, hope, protection, shelter. These are all qualities that we can associate as incentives within this element. But whereas this element would have positive connotations for some cognitions, other cognitions would have a very different experience. Actually, this dense and unyielding landmass can feel rather foreboding to some. Oppression, shackles, codependency, even. These can all be symptoms of negative Earth. And whether Earth is oriented externally or internally depends upon the nature of the lens in CPT. So that's a high-level overview of Earth, and later in this video we're also going to be assigning orientations as well as other qualities. For example, is it internal or external? Is it positive or negative? But for now, let's jump into air. Air is the opposite of Earth, just as intuition is the opposite of sensing. You see, CPT recognizes intuition and sensing as true opposites rather than just vague opposites. Whereas a narrow lens perceives a concrete reality, a broad lens perceives a more abstract reality, of potentialities, for example. Whereas sensing is the narrow lens perceiving the firm and concrete, intuition is the broad lens perceiving the spacious and the abstract. And therefore intuition is naturally impressionistic. It rather perceives open spaces and potentialities. And just as Earth represents matter in solid form, air represents, as the name implies, matter in gaseous form. As such, particles here roam free and have significantly less kinetic resistance. Proportionate, of course, to the force that's pushed upon them, but that's another thing entirely. So whereas Earth represents what is, air represents what could be. Space is to be explored, freedom, independence. But just as with Earth, air can also be aversive to the psyche, a negative element. Negative air can represent insecurity, impermanence, even the void. And it therefore naturally follows that those who embrace Earth reject air. Those who embrace air reject Earth. So we're halfway through our overview of the 4 primordial elements, and guess what? We already have a cognitive axis. We've already talked about sensing and intuition. But through the elemental lens we can see not only the axes, but also the positive and negative element. Positive air counted by negative Earth. Positive Earth counted by negative air. This is just like sensing dominance versus intuition dominance. Sensing oppositional versus intuition oppositional. And later in the video we can also start assigning orientations to the elements. NISE, for example, versus NESI. Because within CPT we actually have 4 perceptual axes rather than just 2. It's not just enough to say sensing versus intuition. We're saying SENI versus SINE. And as such, all 4 of these different perceptual axes have different elemental dispositions. But just as with CPT, this is all very dynamic and prone to change in flux across time as we adapt to new situations, for example. And that's something I actually was looking into in my recent research study. So with the perceptual elements now introduced in a high-level overview, we can turn our attention to the rational elements. So I want to start with fire first because by far it was the most difficult element to map onto cognitive functions. But first let us explore the nature of fire. Fire is consequential. Yeah, it can provide warmth and comfort, but get too close to it and it'll let you know. But when we see fire, we do not just see wanton destruction. We actually see reformation. We see the tearing down of previous atomic structures to make way for something entirely new. We see the cleansing of impurities and the fertilization of new land for a new beginning. More than anything, in true rational element fashion, we see the capacity for change. But unlike in the case of water, this is not the change that occurs gradually through persistent erosion. Rather, change through fire occurs suddenly, even urgently. It is not simply a matter of holding to one's own natural flow and causing change as a result. Rather, in the case of fire, we have a lot of direct intentionality. Fire by its very nature screams the exertion of will upon the world, whether it is to provide warmth and comfort or to reform what we perceive. Fire represents the direct form of control, rather than painting around the edges in a watery fashion. Fire gets straight to the point. This screams the cerebral cortex, the frontal lobe in particular. Fire does not simply exist, it comes into being with the intensity of cognitive executive function, and just as well fades into dormancy once the job is done. Whether the land that is being affected is internal or external can be visited later in a video, but it does not change the nature of the element. Either way, land is being reshaped and restructured. Indeed, just as how frameworks and reality itself are restructured by thinking. So yeah, while I really did have to personally figure this out from the ground up, using earth in this case rather than my usual air, once I did this earthbound approach, a representation of me going outside of my usual cognition, by the way, I could no longer see an alternative. Thinking epitomizes the nature of fire. It's just a little bit harder to see in a case of introverted thinking dominance, for example. But beneath the surface of a seemingly calm and serene TI convergent, the fire rages strongly as they constantly seek to reform and reshape their internal structures. Actually, introverted thinking convergence can be even more control-oriented than extroverted thinking convergence, but that's a story for another time. And I really did want to dedicate some extra minutes to exploring this element. And similarly, whereas a thinking convergent type within CPT, for example an ENFP, would have a positive fire, a thinking divergent type, such as an ENTP, would have negative fire. Indeed, a positive fire represents the joy of alteration and evocation. And yes, on that note, I would love to make a D&D style video at some point. A negative fire does exactly what it says on the tin. Divergent thinkers, especially hyperdivergent thinkers like INFPs, do not want to get burnt. Indeed, they will be rather consistent in their efforts to avoid being burned at all costs, even if it means adapting the very fabric of their being. Whereas positive fire burns like a furnace within someone, motivating them onwards in their quest for reformation. Negative fire is more like a fire pit or campfire, and therefore negative fire types will tend to seek out the comfort of fiery structures, but they will never stray too close to it and certainly not seek to reform the structures themselves. Negative fire types may enjoy the warmth and comfort that comes from being close to the fire, but will do their utmost to ensure they are never set alight themselves. And now we can get to the final of the 4 primordial elements, water. And by process of elimination, we are left with one rational cognitive function to assign to it: feeling. Water is elementally the opposite of fire, but both of these elements are still rational by nature and therefore capable of change. But whereas fire is direct and even short-lived, water is much more consistent. By maintaining its own flow or current, Water essentially creates basins and riverbeds within the world that would allow it to continue to flow at its own pace. And along that vein, while certainly adaptive and fluid on the surface, if you come down hard on water, you're generally going to get hit back. In its peaceful serenity and security in its own formlessness, oftentimes, water belies a depth of character. Indeed, water can carry unseen depths that even the self can be blind to. And the difference between positive and negative water lies in the capacity of a person to swim within it. And as such, positive water types can be likened to merfolk. They tend to happily embrace feeling rather than turn away from it or force a kind of introverted thinking narrative as a substitute, and will happily sit within the depths of the limbic system for prolonged amounts of time, much sooner than turn away from it. Water can be a beautiful element, being the means through which life can grow and persist. It is a nourishing element that brings forth new life and transports matter from one place to the next. And that can be likened to human communication, for example. Like fire, water can be cleansing, but it also tends to be gentler, preserving life while it cleanses. But it can equally be terrifying, and that is something I don't notice people talk about very often. It is all too easy to get sucked into water's depths and proceed to drown within it. Indeed, water can be even more all-consuming than fire. Imagine entire land masses swept under the ocean. Indeed, the earth carries a history of such events. And therefore, to embrace water as a positive element takes just as much bravery as does fire. Whereas water can very much douse fire, fire can also cause water to evaporate and dry out. Dryness and wetness are the true opposites here. And guess what? We now have the other axes, thinking and feeling. If thinking is convergent, think positive fire. One is very direct in one's own exertion of will upon the world, be it internal or external. And negative water would represent fire's capacity here to be doused. And therefore self-adaptation, employment of water positively, tends to be avoided for fear that the great furnaces of the world may be forever doused and lay dormant for all eternity. Change, truth, desires, these must be kept relatively separate from water to ensure that they are not doused. But at the same time, people with positive fire still rely upon water in order to give life to that which they want to reform. But if feeling is convergent, that is, positive water, one instead dives into the ocean or flows freely upon the river. Those who resist fire tend to seek harmony at all costs, the kind of interconnectedness that only water can provide. Fire, after all, here represents the death of ecosystems, the loss of harmony, and must be doused or avoided entirely to ensure that life can continue. But at the same time, positive water still relies upon fire to an extent. It still requires the land to be fertilized, for example. So we've already talked a little bit about the positive and negative elemental planes, but we've yet to talk about the external and internal planes. These are the planes that render an element either deep in quality or expansive in quality. Just to mix it up a bit, let's go in reverse order to what we did before, starting with water. And we can even create a symbol for each element to represent its plane-wise orientation. So first we have expansive water, water that is external and therefore flowing upon the land. A flowing river is the perfect symbol for extroverted feeling. But then we have deep water, that is water that's in the internal plane. Water that is hidden from sight, or of infinite depth. The ocean is a perfect symbol for introverted feeling. Expansive fire is fire that rages upon the land. I feel an inferno is a perfect symbol for extroverted thinking. Whereas deep fire can be likened to a great furnace or molten core. The primary symbol for introverted thinking can therefore be a volcano. But the funnel of a volcano neatly represents the TI into TE expression gateway. What happens once an ISTP finishes the frameworks, for example. Now we have expansive air, that is air upon the external plane. I think the wind is the perfect symbol for extroverted intuition, freely flowing upon the ground from one area to the next. Deep air, by contrast, can represent the hidden pockets of the world, or even vacuums. Actually, running with the vacuums analogy, I'd like to liken introverted intuition to space. The great spacious unknown. A lot stiller than wind, but lots of potentiality. Expansive earth can be considered earth that erects and imprints itself upon the land. The mountain is the ultimate symbol for extroverted sensing, strength of purpose, the ultimate I am here. Deep earth, by contrast, is earth that hardens to become as dense as diamond. What better symbol, therefore, to represent introverted sensing's exquisite fidelity? So I just wanted to end the video on some kind of neat examples and a taster of what might be in store for you if you'd like to see more content like this. I am taking the channel in a direction that kind of personally sits more with me and my own geeky side. So I hope you enjoyed this, and do let me know what you think down in the comments below. And this elemental theory can be employed on its own right. You don't even need to talk about cognitive functions when using this theory. So maybe this video will be the start of something interesting, maybe it won't, but either way I'm looking forward to seeing what everyone thinks. If you did enjoy this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and be sure to share it with anyone else who you think might find it interesting. And if you'd like to explore the elements within you, we can totally talk about it over type coaching or a dedicated type service. I'm pretty flexible in the way that I type people and coach people, so if you'd like to employ this particular framework instead of CPT or MBTI, etc., just get in touch. But in the meantime, that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll be back in about a month. For now, take care.